All right, so for the final part of our lecture, we're going to look at George Eliot, who was the other great Victorian novelist. There were a lot of great Victorian novelists, but the three we've covered so far, I would argue, are the most prominent, important ones. The only exception being Thomas Hardy, but he was writing at the end of the Victorian period, so we'll actually look at him later in this class. Um, George Eliot, I would argue, Emily Bronte was very good, but George Eliot produced a number of novels. I'd argue she's the best female Victorian novelist and on par with Dickens. I think they're two of the best writers in the English language. Um, Her real name is Marianne Evans. She intentionally used a male name when she wrote. We'll talk more about that. Her life, she slowly progressed from rural to more urban settings. So her father was a farm supervisor, and she grew up on the farm when she was really young. Was very close with her father. They'd go on walks together through the countryside that really informed her fiction. She read widely in and out of school, just read a ton, but also went to school. And in her early age, she was influenced by evangelism. When she was 16, she was forced to leave school because her mother died. And after that, she experienced depression and self doubt. As she progressively moved to more urban settings, she went from a farm to a town, lived there, the town of Coventry, with her father at age 21. And there she was exposed to more things, fell in with a group of intellectual friends, started studying philosophy, and at that time, as she was studying philosophy in the town, reluctantly, as the word the textbook uses, decided she could no longer believe in Christianity. This was very disappointing to her father and actually strained their relationship. After her father's death in 1851, she moved to, so she was in her early 30s, moved to London, so fully urban then, and was known for her intellectual philosophical work and got a job at the Westminster Review, which was a prominent journal, and she composed some of her most famous essays then. When she was there, she met another intellectual, George Henry Lewis, who was a literary critic but also a scientist. Um, they fell in love and they never married. He was already married and had three children. He abandoned his wife to be with her, but they lived together from that point on until his death, just 2 years before her death in 1878. So they were common law married, and they both wore this like a badge of honor. Um, but in Victorian society, not everyone approved of that, including her brother Isaac. They had been very close. He never spoke to her again after she eloped with Lewis. Her novel, The Mill on the Floss, a big part of it is a brother-sister relationship, and it captures some of this strain as well as the bonds they had before the strain. All of her novels are worth reading. She composed 7 of them between the 1860s and 1870s, beginning with Adam Bede in 1859 and ending with Daniel Deronda in 1876. The four most famous ones are Adam Bede, The Mill on the Floss, Middlemarch, which many consider to be her greatest work, and Daniel Deronda. Um, so she, with those are four of the best novels in the English language. They'd all be in the top 20, and Middlemarch and Daniel Deronda are fighting each other for a spot in my top 5. Um, so when you have some, and she's a little more overlooked. Everyone knows who Dickens is, but if in her novels are long like Dickens because she's a Victorian, but if you have the time ever, well worth your time. Like with Dickens, I'm going to go through some of the major themes of her work, and then we'll see how they appear in this shorter story. She's been called a belated historian. Almost all of her novels, with the exception of Daniel Deronda, are set in the past, pretty far back, often in the rural types of areas from her childhood. And so she looks back with a historian's perspective, is how she's been described. But not big history. She's very much interested in human lives. and at a specific point in time, how those lives were connected. For instance, Adam Bede, her first novel, which I wrote on in my dissertation for graduate school, depicts this rural farming community, much like the one she grew up on at the turn from the 18th century to the 19th century. But more so than that time period, it's about the drama of four people, two men and two women whose lives become interconnected in the small farming community at that time. And so the historical setting plays an important role, but she's really concerned with the drama of the human lives. So, on one hand, she's this human historian. On the other hand, she's a scientist. She really depicts these cultures from an earlier time um, with a kind of scientific, almost anthropological observation. But again, she's interested in human beings and character more than anything else. And a word that's often used to describe her work is a web. The web of human interaction. She's studying that. Realism, the textbook calls her the greatest English realist, and I think that's true. She strived to portray things as realistically as possible. We talked about in the previous lecture how realism was really the ism, the the characteristic descriptive word for the Victorian period, since Victoria was the queen, um, rather than truly an adjective. Realism is really the adjective for the Victorian period, and Eliot's the best example of that. We're looking at a very unrealistic work of hers, and I'll explain more on that later, but this is what she was known for. And she has essays on it. Her essay, The Natural History of German Life, is great. Um, she describes a peasant as being like a camel, to illustrate her point about how authors claim to be realists but want to dress things up nicely. She wants to get to the gritty truth, which goes to the title of the story, The Lifted Veil. Choice is very important. She chose to walk away from Christianity, and that ended her relationship with her father. She chose to live unmarried with a man who was married and had children. That choice ended her relationship with her brother. She'd been very close to both of them. So choices are very important, and the choices characters make in her works are crucial. She emphasizes, and there's a good quote in the textbook to show this, that she did not make any of her choices lightly. And um, that's really important to understanding her characters and the choices they make. Feminism. She seems sympathetic to a feminist view. She depicts women who were independent and autonomous, and um, feminist literary critics often try to use her and show how she was feminist, but it becomes complicated and I think frustrating to feminist scholars because at the ends of her novels, she often stresses more traditional values. And so, what do you make of this? This is complicated back and forth. For instance, in her novel Adam Bede, one of the main characters, Dinah Morris, is a Methodist preacher who travels about, a nomadic Methodist preacher. And so a female preaching was a big deal at the time. And she's this very, compared to the other female main characters, she's this very independent, autonomous, modern type of character. But at the end of the novel, spoiler alert, she's married. The Methodists have banned female preaching, and she's very content to live this life at home. And so that kind of duality to the representation of a character makes interpreting Eliot through a feminist lens very complicated. But I think what she's really getting at is that human nature is complex and it's not a simple question of are you a feminist or not. It's a question of every individual is different and human nature is this complex beast that she attempts to unravel. And so she rather would show the nuances of life than take one clearly defined political stance. And so she often lands in the middle ground on issues, and people have a hard time defining where she stands. But in my opinion, that's the brilliance of her work because she shows the complexity of life and human nature. Finally, along those same lines, sympathy is huge for Eliot. She recognized that all humans have flaws. No one is perfect. And so there's no clear cut hero or villain in her texts. Dickens, by contrast, has some morally upright characters with no flaws and some one-note, purely evil villains. You're not going to find that in Eliot. Every character, even the most um, depraved of them, is humanized in some way. And so that's part of her realism. That's part of the sympathy she felt for other people. That's part of her wanting to represent humanity, common humanity, and the intricacies of it more than feminism. So she really represents people as they are, being that they're all human, they're all flawed, but we can find sympathy for almost anyone. Um, So this is a picture I wanted to show you. This is the town of Middlemarch from her most critically acclaimed novel. And that novel has all of these side characters who basically gossip. But the gossip becomes like a character itself in the novel and ends up being crucial to the plot because characters communicate important information through it. So why is that important? Well, it shows the interconnectedness of human nature, which is something she loves studying. And I thought this map of the fictional town, it looks kind of like a web. I thought it would convey that. It was such an important theme to her. I wanted to share that before we dive into the lifted veil. So we're going to look at a few passages from the lifted veil, and this is technically a work of science fiction. It's her only work of science fiction. The problem with Eliot in teaching her in a class like this is much like the problem of Dickens. I didn't want to use the readings included in the textbook. These are the two most famous novelists, famous writers, since they're novelists from the Victorian period. But 90% of what they wrote was 700 plus pages. You can't read that in a class like this. The editors of the Norton have done a good job trying to find works representative of their careers, but I don't think they've done the best job that they could. No disrespect. And so I tried to pick works that I think are very representative of their significant literary careers. And so um, the Lifted Veil is even more of a departure from what she typically does than The Signal Man is from what Dickens typically does. But it still illustrates a lot of the themes we just talked about on the previous slide. And so even though it's a work of science fiction, when 99% of what she wrote was stark realism, the themes she conveyed through her realism come through in this work of science fiction. And that's what we're going to look at here. My first quote is, "So absolute is our soul's need of something hidden and uncertain, for the maintenance of that doubt and hope and effort which are the breath of its life, that if the whole future were laid to us beyond a day, the interest of mankind would be bent on the hours that lie between." Sorry for the typo. So basically, Vladimir has this ability that lets him see into the future as well as into people's minds, and it's incredibly painful. It's not a gift, it's a curse. And part of it is there's no mystery, there's nothing left to figure out. And what he's saying here is that um, human nature is we need some mystery, we need some suspense. But it goes a step deeper into something worse. And then the curse of insight, of my double consciousness, came again and has never left me. I knew all their narrow thoughts, their feeble regard, their half wearied pity. So the issue, part of what makes it painful for Latimer, really the key thing that makes it painful is he sees people thinking bad things, and he then begins to see humans in only a negative way, as self-interested individuals. So the curse of this gift is it makes him the reverse of what Eliot idealizes in what she does herself. I talked about how one of the key things about Eliot is that every character is humanized, even the worst character is humanized. And Latimer is a prime example because he's really annoying. He's very self focused, but we can still find sympathy for him at certain points. And so for Eliot, every character can and should be humanized. But Latimer can't do that. He can't humanize anyone. He only sees the worst in them when he hears their thoughts. And that's ultimately his downfall, as we'll see. Um, we're going to continue to look at why his inability to sympathize with others is problematic. And that's represented in a quote talking about his relationship with his father here. This is when his father finds out that Latimer's marrying Bertha now that his brothers died. "My father was happier than he had thought of being again. My marriage, he felt sure, would complete the desirable modification of my character and make me practical and worldly enough to take my place in society among sane men. So basically, Latimer, kind of like the signal man, is separated from society and isolated. But for Latimer, it's because of his own personality and choices. He is unable to sympathize with others. Now, I don't know if this is just his personality and how he always was, or it's part of the curse of this insight, this double consciousness he has. That would be a good question for you to answer for me. But either way, he can't communicate, he can't connect with others, but it's ultimately because he's selfish. He's more focused on himself than others. And so when this is the key to understanding it. When he hears other thoughts, they're bad thoughts, he thinks the worst. He doesn't stop and say, let me try to appreciate what this person is going through, what they're struggling through, and maybe then I can understand why they're thinking this bad thought. That's what Eliot does. She takes the worst characters, shows you their circumstances and humanizing them. Latimer is too selfish. He can't get outside of himself enough to think about what the other person might be going through and why that might make them seem so awful when he's just hearing their thoughts. Finally, we have a description of Bertha. And I really think Bertha is the more interesting character here worth studying. But this is, the reason she appeals to him is that he can't read her mind. So the thing that tortures him isn't present when she's around. But eventually, once they're married, he can hear her thoughts. And he realizes that she's manipulative, hasn't always been telling the truth, and is much more selfish than he initially thought. And so there's no mystery left. There's nothing to protect him from the curse of knowing her thoughts. And so he then loses all interest in her. And this is the quote when that happens. But now that her soul was laid open to me, now that I was compelled to share the privacy of her motives, to follow all the petty devices that preceded her words and acts, she found herself powerless with me, except to produce in me the chill shudder of repulsion, powerless because I could be acted on by no lever within her reach. So what happens in the story is once he can hear her thoughts, she's no longer appealing to him, but he's also no longer appealing to her. Neither of them is getting out of the marriage what they got out of it before. He got out of it a reprieve from hearing others' thoughts. And we don't really know what she got out of it. We don't really know why he married her. Because a really important thing to interpreting this story is that we don't ever get any true objective view of Bertha. We have a first person narrator. He's very unreliable. We'll talk about that more on the next slide. And our entire perception of Bertha is filtered through Latimer. It's corrupted, to say. So we don't really know what to think of her. We only know what he thinks of her, and it's pretty bad. But what he thinks is that she really only wanted to control him and use him, and once he's no longer interested in her, she can't do that. So they drift apart. I think this is an instance of feminism, going back to the idea that a lot of Eliot's work can be interpreted as feminist. I think this is actually a prime example of where she really goes feminist. If we take Latimer at face value, it's like anti-feminist. But the whole point is that we can't take Latimer at face value. We have to, it's almost like one of Browning's dramatic monologues where we only get one perspective, but we have enough surrounding context to know that that perspective is not trustworthy. So potentially, Bertha could be a very sympathetic figure. We just don't know. So I think I'll talk more about this on the next slide. I think what the novel does is it forces us to try to imagine what we would think of Bertha if our only perception of her were not from Latimer. If we had another more objective perspective, it tries to force us to imagine that, and I think that's a feminist act. We only see Bertha through the male gaze, but by showing the male gazer as an unreliable individual, Eliot's trying to push us to go beyond it. Even though we can only imagine it, we can't actually know it. And that's a really intriguing thing. Let's talk about So here are my theses. The title is really important. The lifting of the veil. What is that? On one level, it's Latimer being able to see into other people's minds. But Eliot, throughout her career, worked at seeing beyond social proprieties. The Victorian period was this period where it kind of everyone had their guard up and everyone was supposed to act a certain way, and there was a lot more going on beneath the surface. Eliot wanted to pull back that veneer. So she experiments with it. She depicts that a lot in her later novels. Daniel Deronda, the protagonist of Daniel Deronda, Gwendolyn Harleth, is very similar to Bertha. And Gwendolyn seems like a pretty selfish, manipulative character. But as the novel goes on, we learn the context of her circumstances is pretty horrible, and she's experiencing some pretty horrible things. But we never get a direct explanation of what those things are. We have to kind of peel through the layers and interpret it. And so um, Eliot was very much committed to peeling back the layers and seeing what was beneath the surface, since so much of it was covered up during the Victorian period. But it has to be mediated by sympathy. That's clutch. Vladimir fails at this. If we read the novel at face value, and really this is a novella, which is something longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel. So if we read the novella at face value, it would seem to be anti lifting the veil because it's bad for Latimer. But again, we can't trust Latimer in this specific instance. He has no sympathy for others, which is what Eliot values above all else. So the lifting of the veil can be a good thing if once we see into the other person's circumstances, we have sympathy rather than scorn for them. Why is Latimer unreliable? We got to answer that to understand my interpretation. Well, his gift, it's disturbing to him, so that's complicating things. His health is deteriorating. He's predicted from the beginning he's going to die, and he does. His mind is clearly troubled. He's selfish. So we really can't trust him. The unreliable narrator is an interesting literary technique because you then have to read around what the narrator is saying. And in this case, we only have one narrator. A lot of novels with unreliable narrators, like Wuthering Heights, provide multiple narrators, some more trustworthy than others. We only have one narrator. We can't trust him at all. So Eliot's really forcing us to think outside the box, to think critically in different ways here. Again, feminism, I want to flesh this out more. The true lifting of the veil is a deeper insight to Bertha, one that we can only infer if we attempt to see beyond Latimer's selfishness, lack of sympathy, and unreliability as a narrator. We don't know. She could be awful, but Latimer only presents her as awful, and we can't trust him. So if we try to see beyond that, we might be able to conjecture that she is, in some ways, a sympathetic human figure, even if she does have some flaws like her selfishness. All human beings are selfish. So I think Eliot's really pushing us in that direction, and that's what she's trying to lift the veil on. Women were heavily critiqued during the Victorian period for their behavior. And so Eliot's saying, let's pull back the veil, see what's really going on, and understand that behavior. It's kind of an extension of what Wollstonecraft says about don't ask me to be virtuous if you're not giving me the ability to be virtuous. It's let's pull the curtain back and see what's going on and understand why people behave the way they do instead of just critiquing how they behave. My last 2 points here connect this story to the Signal Man. I thought that'd be a nice way to wrap up. Irony is really important in both stories, and reading signs and communication is important. Vladimir has the ability to hear others' thoughts, but he can't communicate with them. That's the use of irony to point out that we can't trust him. The Signal Man is great at his job. His job is interpreting and giving signals. The engineer signals to him to move or be killed, and he has time to move, but he doesn't and he dies. So I don't know why. That's that open denouement at the end of Dickens's story. But there's some irony there that the Signal Man in some way, unless he actively chooses to die, fails to interpret the signal. Finally, realism. We have a work of science fiction by Eliot and a work with these supernatural Gothic elements by Dickens. Both could be termed as unreality. And these are novelists, especially Eliot, who are known for their realism. But what you have is sympathy being the most important thing for Eliot, and that really conveyed in The Lifted Veil. Vladimir is unable to sympathize despite his abilities. He forces us to sympathize with Bertha. And in The Signal Man, we have this critique of well, not critique, this assuaging of the pain caused and the alienation caused by the sweeping changes of Victorian progress or Victorian capitalism. And Dickens uses the supernatural and the real combined there to facilitate that. So both short works of fiction achieve what a novelist achieved in their longer novels in a short space. Sympathy for Eliot, response to Victorian progress, and its aftermath for Dickens. So I hope you enjoyed these stories. I absolutely loved them. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I can't wait to read your thoughts about them. Really, if you're fascinated in literary studies, fascinated by the Victorian period, if you just appreciate good novels, you've got to read Dickens and Eliot at some point. Even if you're not a fan of what they do, there's no one else who really does what they do in the English language, and it's quite impressive and representative of the Victorian period.